right. So where'd your parents' family first come from, Barry?
My parents' family first came from Eastern Russia. One came from Russia, one came from Lithuania.
Do you remember any stories they told you?
I remember stories about when they were here. Some of the stories they told me were my father's father, my Zeta, on my father's side, was kind of a ragman. You know, had a horse and sold schmatas, rags, and things like that. And then in the wintertime, he would sell coal. He would deliver coal, fill sacks of it up, put it on his back, carry it up and down flights of stairs. And in the summertime, he would carry blocks of ice with those big ice tongs.
How did he get around from place to place?
Horse and buggy.
See, you answered horse and buggy. So
He got around from place to place with a horse and buggy. That's how they traveled in those days.
yes.
Or they walked.
Say it again. Or they walked.
Or they walked.
Okay. What else do you remember about him?
I don't remember my Zeta Sherman at all. I mean, I remember pictures of my Zeta Sherman, but I don't really have a memory of him at all. But I do remember my Bubby Sherman, who I refer to generally on a daily basis, making up things that she said and quoting, Thoreau or whatever, and attributing it to my Bubby said this. But I remember her being really short, stocky, yenta with a mustache, very unhappy woman. Today she would have, I can't place what particular female disease she would have, but she would definitely have some type of depressive disease today that is probably curable, but that she had then.
Why do you say that?
Because I just remember she was a very unhappy woman, cried all the time, was a great cook. House always smelled great. And I just remember her as the most unhappy person I have ever encountered in my entire life. I don't have one recollection of my Bubby being happy.
Now this was on the
Sherman side.
Okay, what about on your mom's side?
On my mom's side, I have no recollection of either one of my grandparents at all. I mean, I think my grandparents passed away before I was born or when I was very, very little.
Did your mom ever tell you stories about them?
Oh, sure. My grandfather, Hutkin, my Zeta Hutkin, was a shoemaker, and he physically made shoes. That's what they did. They were shoemakers. He repaired them and he made them. And at the house on one of my glass shelves, I have a boot that he made. It's the only thing left that I have from him. But they used to put them in the windows in the old days, and that would be their models and their displays. And this is a little high-top boot that laces up, and it's beautiful. I mean,
what does your mom have to say about him? What was he like?
Oh, my mom always said that, it was like, I have recollection of my parents being, really good people. That's what I heard from my parents, that their parents were good people. They were honest people, they were good people, they were hardworking people, good work ethics, and that's what people did in those days. I never honestly heard on my mother's side anything bad about her parents or the family, and just that they helped each other. They brought other family over from Europe. They all stuck pretty close together in their little shtetl in Wellston, and wherever they were, like on Biddle Street in those days. And no bad stories, no bad recollections. Now we switch over to my father's side. That's a little bit different. My father's side was a little more aggressive, kind of like the Jewish, mild-mannered Corleone family, just much more hot-tempered, much more volatile, My family has always been down on Produce Row for as long as Produce Row's been there. There's been a Sherman on Produce Row.
Okay, stop. All right, Brian, he's giving you a lot of windows that you can open up. He's talked about Wellston. Do you know what Wellston is?
Yeah.
You know what Little Street is?
No.
Okay, those are windows you can open up. So you can say, Dad, you mentioned Wellston, you mentioned Biddle Street. Talk about those. What were those?
Okay.
That's an open-ended question that you're doing a probe. You're probing on some nuggets of information he's given you that he really didn't elaborate on. You have an opportunity to get him to elaborate on those. So what was Wellston, Barry?
Wellston was kind of just like a suburb is, and it was a kind of like Clayton, University City, Delmar Boulevard today. It was where a lot of ethnic groups lived in different areas of Wellston. You had a lot of Jewish people up around Maffitt, Cope Brilliant. You had a lot of Italian people that kind of overlapped that area. I can't really mentally place all those streets right now, but you had Bird, Wells, God, Easton. You know, I just can't. I can see them. I just can't place them all. But you know, there were pockets of like one 3-block area was all Italian, one 3-block area was all Jewish. Very few African American people in the area in those days. But then the neighborhoods mixed and overlapped, where everyone lived together. Really, kind of a real melting pot area. And you know, you had schools there. We lived across the street from Arlington School. The front of our house faced the back of Arlington School, and there was an alley that we lived on the alley. And between the two alleys, there was an older woman on one side of the alley named Katie, who used to scare the living shit out of me because she was an older single woman and, you know, an old maid that would have been an old maid then that I didn't have any idea. She had cats, which Uncle Alan killed one actually one day by poking it one too many times. That was a major disaster. I never really knew her, but it was like a haunted house. It was like the house you didn't want to go to, God forbid, for any reason. But later on, when I grew up, I found out that she used to give my mom and dad money for food, you know, because we had 5 kids. She had no children. I don't know what she did. You'd have to ask your uncles. But, you know, she had a job somewhere. Maybe she was a librarian. Maybe she was a secretary. But the bottom line is she turned out to be a very nice, helpful, giving person who scared the crap out of me whenever I saw her.
Let me stop you at this point. Now, what happened by my asking him about Wellston is he's now blended over from talking about his parents and grandparents to talking about his childhood. Okay? We can continue with that, or we can go back to parents and grandparents. One of the things I wanted to follow up on. How did your grandparents meet? This was in the old country, right?
My grandparents on both sides met in the old country. I have no clue how they met. I mean, in those days, people met because they were put together. You know, you lived in small areas, and, you know, obviously today and then you were not allowed to marry like your sister, your brother. It wasn't really good to marry your first cousin, especially Eastern European. You could wind up with so many physical, mental horrors. But I think it was just like dating or anything else today. But, you know, they had matchmakers, you know, that would make what they called a shidduch, that would put people together. And I'm sure that's how they met. I mean, I'm sure they didn't go to like Wigwam in U City from high school, and, you know. But it was just real common for you to meet at shul, to meet at, you know, maybe the park, different functions. Families did go to school in those days. It's just that depending on how wealthy you were or how poor you were, you had to either quit school and work, or you could maybe continue at school through high school or something. But I just really don't know.
What about your parents? How did they meet?
I think my parents met at a dance. This is one of these times where actually, if you had all the brothers together, the older ones would remember more what happened. But I just have this vague recollection that they kind of met at a dance. And, from the dance, they, just dated and, eventually my dad being fairly possessive and my mom not being possessive at all, I think that's probably how they wound up together. Because I heard stories where my dad would like to pound people that would, talk to her, say things out of the way, just probably normal conversation today, But I'm not really sure how they met. I don't really honestly know.
Any idea how long they dated?
Well, they probably dated for every bit of a year or more, because in those days you didn't date for 3 months or 6 months and generally get married. So I would imagine that they dated for at least a year, maybe even a little more.
What was their life like when they first got married? What did your dad do, and how did they get along with one another?
When they first got married, I would have no clue how they
No
got.
stories? You had no stories that...
I mean, I didn't hear any stories any different than anybody else. They got married. My mom was working for like the May Company at the time, and my dad, going back that far, probably drove a service car, which was kind of a taxi service from the airport to Union Station, which was a hot spot in those days. And between the two of them, that's, how they made a, meager living. But then again, in those areas that they were living in around Biddle Street and, down really where the Laclede's Landing is today, everybody lived like that. So nobody knew anybody was poor because they all lived the same way. Then they started having children. And, after 5 children, I don't know, where to head from here, but...
Well, how did they run the house? Who did what? My
dad was the patriarch of the house. I mean, what he said went. My mom ran the house, though. I mean, it's like, my dad could say whatever he wanted to, but when he left the house, my mom ran the house. I mean, my mom did the cooking, she did the cleaning, she, did everything domestic that you would expect someone in those days to do. My dad went to work. And, he made his living and came home. And for 20 some odd years, he drove a yellow cab, taxi cab, and moved on from driving a taxi cab to, what did he do? He opened up a grocery store, kind of grocery produce store in East St. Louis, right in the heart of East St. Louis, when it was just becoming a mixed neighborhood. It had been fairly white, then it became kind of mixed, and now he'd been there 3, 4, 5 years, and it had started to become very, African American, and people said at the time that East St. Louis was deteriorating. Now they make movies about it. But he had a store there for a long time. The store happened to belong to his sister. He only had one sister, Irene, and the store belonged to Irene, and her husband, I think his name was Lou Bierman, and he was also a shoemaker, and he had a shoe store in that store. And I think when he passed away, my dad wound up with that store, and obviously he wasn't a shoemaker, so he went into the kind of produce, not delicatessen at that time, just a regular grocery store. And then he moved on from that to coming over to St. Louis to open up a first little delicatessen on Price and Olive.
Okay. If you were considering the person that you become, what did you learn from your dad and what did you learn from your mom?
Okay. Let me back up 1 second, then I'll answer that question, because I really didn't finish the last part of the other. How did my mom and dad get along? As long as I can remember, and I lived in the house a long time, they fought every single morning of their life. That was their ritual. They fought about something. It could have been anything. I mean, I can't even tell you some of the things they fought about. My dad had 500 canaries and never less than 3 or 4 dogs. We had Chihuahuas, we had German Shepherds, we had Dobermans. They overlapped, they crossed over. We had them at the same times. You know, animals would get sick in the neighborhood. People would bring them over to my dad. He kind of had like a green thumb to cure dogs, and you know, never really fooled with too many cats. But any kind of birds, any kind of dogs. My dad was a pretty good vet. Actually, he was such a good vet. Vets used to use him sometimes when they had problems, especially with birds. But every morning of their lives, they bitched and yelled and screamed about something. Never went on past breakfast. Never happened after that. But every morning it happened for as long as I can remember. That was the end of my story to the close of that part. And then you have to ask me the question again because I forgot.
Considering the person you become.
Okay, considering the person I've become.
What did you learn from your dad? What did you learn from your mom?
Okay, what did I learn from my dad? What did I learn from my mom to bring me to the point of where I've become today? We'll start with my mom. My mom was probably one of the nicest, sweetest people anybody would ever want to meet. And everybody's nice when you're dead. I mean, you know, it's like people have good recollections of people when they're dead, even if they weren't so nice. But my mother was generally a wonderful, caring, giving, just a gute neshama. She was just a good person. Seldom, ever did I hear my mom say a curse word. I mean, seldom ever in my whole life, up until being married, having children, and my dad cursed around my mom. I mean, it's like me. It's like I have that same bad habit, but never around the kids generally until they got much older. And my mom never was like that. I mean, she just never followed in his footsteps like that. Never had a bad word to say about people, always there to help people. Used to take in relatives, used to take in friends. My brother Alan had a lot of wayward friends, and a lot of them lived at the house, you know, when we could barely afford, or they could barely afford to take care of the 5 kids they had. We always had boarders at our house. I mean, it was commonplace. When we were on Cote Brilliant, when we lived on Purdue, you could always come to the Shermans for a meal. You could always come there for a safe home. That was my mom, you know. And I don't remember all the years I've ever talked to anybody that anybody really had anything bad to say about my mom, even through someone else, where things came back and said, oh, your mom's this or that or the other. She really was just a good person. Yeah, 'cause I remember your mother like that too. My dad was a character. He was hot-tempered. He was a wild man when he had to be. He was a hard worker. He was, I mean, he would work 8 days a week, 30 hours a day, and he did it all of his life. And I know it sounds crazy, but it's like he loved to work, and I think working was his hobby. He had the birds. He always had, you know, at least 200 or 300 canaries. It's just, you can't even fathom this. But he used to sneak them into the house in his pockets. He would take the kids with him to places that were raising birds, and he would always have to have this one and that one and a red siskin and a I mean, I can't even remember the names of some of these things. You know, a harlequin and a this and a that. And he would sneak them in his pockets, and he would put them in his shirt, and he would put them in shoe boxes and punch holes in the shoe boxes with a pencil. And everybody had to help him smuggle birds into the house, because he always had to have like that, I mean, like the fabulous one. You know, he had to come home with the next fabulous bird, which was one of the arguments they used to have every morning, because if you have one bird, he chirps a little bit. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 500 birds, you can't even believe what it's like when the sun comes up in the morning. And I mean, he loved animals. You know, he was a caring, giving person. He was super protective. I mean, super protective of the family, relatives, both sides. I mean, anybody had a problem, they called Dan Sherman. He would come over. Usually the problem would be solved if it was physical. You know, not an educated man. I don't think he made it through high school like a lot of people in those days. Never served in the war because he got a deferment because he had so many children. Actually, I was born right after the war. But, you know, just good people, good, honest, solid people, you know, that made America. You know, that was pretty much how people were in those days. You know, it's just that the Sherman side of the family was a little more territorial, physical, a little more violent. You know, not kill people, but, you know, it's like they just didn't take any shit from anybody. Like, you know, you bothered them, they hurt you. So most people didn't bother them.
If you could have 5 minutes
Mm-hmm.
with your dad today,
Mm.
how would you want to spend that 5 minutes?
Wow. If I could have 5 minutes with my dad today, how would I spend that 5 minutes? That's a great question. And I have no clue. But I will tell you, he would probably enjoy going back down the basement, turning the light on, visiting these 500 canaries that he had, because I'm not exaggerating, when he passed away, that's what I took care of until we found a home for all of them. But I would go down the basement, turn the light on, and help him clean the cages and feed the birds. And he would examine, you know, numerous ones of them that didn't look quite good to him or look great to him. And I think that's probably what would make him the happiest if we had 5 more minutes to share.
How about your mom?
My mom, if I had 5 more minutes to spend with my mom, I think that I would probably take her to Jack in the Box when it was on Woods Mill and Olive, and just sit down and talk to her about whatever she wanted to talk about. Because it was like, I used to say to her all the time, come on, we'll go someplace nice. We'll go to this place. We'll go to that place. We'll go to Sparrow's. We'll go to this. She goes, no, you know what? I got a taste for Jack in the Box. You know, and that's the kind of people they were. It's like, you know, if you could take them to Tony's or you could take them to Jack in the Box, they were just like normal people. It's like, if you were in the mood for Jack in the Box, that's where you went.
Good questions, huh?
That's a tough question, that last question. That's a brutal question.
Yeah. Plus to put you on the spot, not give you a chance to think about it.
Yeah, it does. And it's just really a tough question because it's like there's so many things you could do.
Yeah. Brian, let's go. You're on.
Except for one thing. Did you check your mic?
Gotcha.
I may have turned it off accidentally.
Yeah, you're okay.
When we were doing this with my mother-in-law,
Mhm.
my father-in-law kept picking around. He was sneezing, coughing, and he had the dryer on, and the buzzer kept going off. And we said, Marvin, get out of here. But he was so interested in what she was saying
Mm-hmm.
that he kept hovering, you know, and there are a lot of neat distraction noises in the background.
Yeah. You can tell people that too. You know, it's like sometimes there'll be distraction noises in the background, but they'll really be neat.
Okay.
Like your cat throwing up.
Dad, tell me about where you lived growing up, and do you remember your address?
Do I remember my address where I grew up, and what do I remember about growing up? My address was 5563 Cote Brilliant. I remember the front of the house had a porch. It was like a ranch. It was all brick, which was fairly common in that part of the neighborhood. I remember that there was a window right as you looked at the front of the house to the left. There was a window, and behind that window was my mom and dad's room, because I remembered somebody tried to crawl through that window one night while my mom and dad were in bed. I remember the alley. I remember the back of Arlington School, facing the front of our house. I remember there was like a what would be like a enclosed carport today, and it had a tar roof. And when we got a little bit older, we used to jump off the roof over at the playground. I remember the playground had a fence all the way around it, with spikes at the top of the fence. It was kind of like Old English looking, like spears, which was also pretty common in those days to have that kind of decoration. I don't remember the inside at all. I mean, I couldn't tell you what it looked like. I remember there was a back door to the, I remember you could go out the back screen door and go out into the yard. I'm pretty sure it was either there or Purdue. I don't remember which one.
Is there anything else that you remember about your house?
That particular house?
Mm-hmm.
Very little. That's about it.
Who are your brothers and sisters, Dad? Older or younger than you?
My oldest brother is Melvin, they call him Mel. Except when I leave messages for him on the machine, on the recorder, I say, Melvin. Other than that, I just call him Mel generally. And then the next brother, Melvin, is 10 years older than I am, so I'm 55, he would be 65. The next brother down would be William, Billy. He's 7 years older than I am. Next brother down would be Alan, and he would be 6 years older than I am. Then Barry, and then we have one sister, Florine, who's 3 years younger than I am.
What was a typical day like in your house with all those kids?
Crazy. A typical day in the house was, because at one time on Purdue, 1214 Purdue, everyone lived there. My brother Mel wasn't married yet. He used to sleep upstairs. He would work nights and then come home and sleep during the day. I probably didn't see him awake probably 3 times in 2 years. My brother, well, all of us, we were all there in the house. My mom would cook 10 meals a day. She would clean up 50 times a day. Everybody would bring somebody home with them. You know, it was a madhouse. My aunt Liz, my mom's sister, used to live with us, and her claim to fame actually was that she could actually put a cigarette in her mouth. She smoked either Lucky Strikes or Pall Mall, and she would stick it to the bottom of her lip, and as she would talk, the cigarette would stay on the bottom of her lip, and then every once in a while, when the ash got to be like half the cigarette, she would flick it in her hand. It was like amazing. I don't think people can do that today. But it was just a crazy, crazy house of constantly things going on there.
Tell me about some of the other people in the house, friends.
Oh, well, my brother Alan would always have at least 1 to 2 strays. Kurt Miller, Barry Schneider, Joe Finicaro. I mean, I just can't think of all the names of all the people that he, wayward. It's like his part of the contribution to the house was he used to bring wayward people home. And then my brother Bill was pretty quiet. He really didn't have a lot of friends, and it was pretty much to himself. Mel, once in a while, I guess he would bring somebody home. But he always worked, and he was the oldest, and he was out of the house probably more than he was in the house. Had 2 great cars, though, 57 Chevy and a 58 Chevy, or a 56 and 57 Chevy, candy apple red, gorgeous cars. I do remember those. I remember my brother Alan had I think a 55 Ford convertible, white as snow, top, everything. Great car.
Tell me a little bit about your friends and what type of things you did together.
Had a lot of different friends. made a lot of friends at University City High School, different assortment of friends. I had friends like Bob Portnoy, Jerry Stone, Jerry Kreisman, Shelley Kaplan, who were much brighter than I was, much more into achievement, did a lot more things than I did in those days, just going places, doing things. A lot of times I was just working at my dad's store, doing something. And then I had friends that were on, kind of like middle ground, which was like Ralph Goodman, Larry Galeen, Morris Levin, who were actually, I was brighter than they were. And, I was kind of like at the top of that heap right there with like Billy Taylor and I can't think of all the names, but, and then I had like a group of friends at the end, where I kind of like juggled friends and it was like, Johnny Mazinas and Bill Peppas, who was kind of somewhere between the middle and the end. I don't know. Bill was strange. And then, names I can't even think of now that Portnoy could probably think of. And it was like, it was a really great mix of people I was friendly with because it was like, Portnoy became, PhD with more degrees than a thermometer. And, Jerry Stone's a psychologist and Shelley Kaplan is like one of the top people in infectious disease in pediatrics in the United States. It's just like, and Mazinas is probably in jail for murder. I haven't heard from him for a while. Peppas has got a bar that he owns down in Central West End. Jack Rinaldi, Terry Lasky. Terry's like he was the fastest kid at U City at the time in our grade. Really good athlete, running, whatever, good football player. Didn't have the brains to come in out of the rain, still doesn't, and is about as obnoxious as anybody you've ever want to meet. And actually, to spin off of that, I used to deliver papers on the back of his dad's truck because his dad was the Post-Globe paperman. He had paper routes.
Tell me more about delivering the papers.
Oh, God. Wintertime, summertime, Terry would call me up and say, you got to help me out a little bit. My dad needs help, whatever. And so his dad would pick me up in the morning or I would sleep at his house. Generally, his dad would pick me up, like 2 o'clock in the morning. We'd go out. We'd get on the truck. We'd roll papers. We'd roll the papers up. And then they had like a little machine that had like a little U-shaped arm. And you'd put the rolled paper in there and it would snap the string around it and tie it. It was like really cool. It would just automatically tie the paper. And then I don't think we stuffed papers in plastic bags and stuff like that. It was just, you would roll it up and you would snap it and then you would throw it off the back of the truck. And, everybody got a paper. You'd throw them left, you'd throw them right. You throw them, you try to get them on their driveways, in the middle of their lawn, by their mailbox, wherever they wanted them. People actually had requests in those days for where they wanted their paper thrown, in particular at their house. And then occasionally we would have churches or synagogues or something where, we'd have to get out of the truck and, schlep up a hill or something with 20 papers. And, that was his paper route. That's what his dad did.
Tell me about your first car.
My first car. My first car was, I'm going to guess, a 1962, 63, I'm not sure, Plymouth Valiant that was repainted black because it had been either gray or some color because they had a paint over where it said like Laclede Gas Company. And it was a push button automatic shift on the dash. So there's no stick shift, there's no lever, no column lever. When you wanted to get into drive, you would push the button on the dash and it would put you in drive. When you wanted to get into reverse, you'd have to put your foot on the brake, put it at a dead stop, and change by pushing the button in. Actually, it was a pretty neat car. It used to burn. I took it to college with me, it used to burn at least 1 to 2 quarts of oil up, and at least that much going back. But it was a great little car.
Art Bricker?
Art Bricker.
The
Art,
Esquires?
Art and Hetty Bricker and the Esquires. God, give us some memory of that, because I don't have a great memory of that.
Eugene LaRiche?
Oh, yeah, Eugene LaRiche. Stan Yakovitz. Remember Stan Yakovitz? Great ball player.
Yeah.
He's a pharmacist today.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
And Aunt Liz's cigarette dangling?
Aunt Liz's cigarette dangling.
She's just rolling off
Oh,
that cigarette.
she could do an ash minimum half of the cigarette before she'd have to tap it in her hand and then take it over to an ashtray or something to put it down.
I remember that.
And it's amazing because my mom never smoked. And my dad only smoked at night.
Oh.
My father never smoked in the daytime ever that I can remember. He only smoked at night.
All right, let's stop already because we'll go on.
Oh, I thought we were stopped.
Um,
Hello.
press the red button.
Testing.